I am so excited to share a new expansion of my Wonder Camera project with the launch of artist Leah Roh's Lube River 2.0, a new chamber of wonder and inquiry that represents Leah's art and research in sex positivity.
I'm Mora, a comfort and sex avatar in the Wonder Camera universe, and I am so happy to be conducting this interview today with Leah Roh. Leah, my first question for you, yes, is in many families, topics such as sex and pleasure are completely off limits. Where did you learn about sex growing up?
Well, unfortunately, if topics surrounding sexuality and sex education are not discussed in the household or at school, the porn industry and pop culture is how children and young adults learn about sex, sexuality, and topics of consent. Hence why women in heterosexual relationships tend to believe that their role in the bedroom is only to satisfy their male partners, and their own personal sexual pleasure is always an afterthought. Movies always, they tend to frequently portray sexual encounters also without any dialogue or communication, which is a terrible way to educate audiences on how to ask for consent and cultivate healthy relationships with your partner or partners.
Sure. And so, based on that, what are other resources for children, or what other resources should exist for children to learn about sex?
So I believe that children should learn about sex in any environment that is conducive to open and honest conversations. I think adults really need to speak to children with total transparency on sex and relationships, especially when it comes to educating children and young adults on the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation. I think it is very imperative that children know that gender is a construct and that they don't need to adhere to these traditional roles set by society of how a woman should behave, of how a man should act or behave.
Right, right. My next question was, where do you think our conversations about sex are lacking? And I think, you were already really speaking to that. And that's probably why you, Carol, and Issa started Motherload. But do you want to talk more about those inspirations for starting the collective Motherload?
So, my two female creative partners and I, Carol Sivray and Issa Ghaffari, decided to start Motherload and build this VR digital art collective from a shared experience that we had at a VR startup in New York City, where I had met them when we were all interns, essentially working for this all male founded VR startup, and we all felt that our work and our worth was not essentially being valued or appreciated. So we decided to team together and try to create new outlets for VR as a medium, because we had only previously seen through this startup that we were working for how VR is really only applied to games and entertainment, and we really wanted to focus our VR experiences on more education and storytelling.
Right, right. And so that was your first installment of Motherload, Lube River. Can you maybe go into more of a description of the experience for those who haven't tried it? And just to let everyone know, the space that we're in right now was inspired by Lube River. This is Lube River 2.0 social VR version.
So, Lube River was developed for the Oculus Rift, and users, once you're in the headset, can journey down a river of lube on a vagondola that we had modeled, and throughout the experience, the user is collecting different sex toys that they can learn about, and have them talk to you and teach you about the different amenities and tools and applications. We really wanted to create a very, fun and entertaining, on the side of humorous and a bit comical experience to destigmatize this whole topic of masturbation and sexual pleasure. So any users journeying down Lube River can really hear about the different features of these sex toys, learn about the diversity of sex toys available, and just have a fun and memorable time doing so.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many fear tactics often used by educators to talk about sex. And one thing that I really love about Lube River was the playfulness and the way you had these sex toy characters who are non threatening and just very playful. And it adds another level to our thinking about sex and taboo, and that it is a place of joy and positivity. I think that's another, really important aspect of your work. And then your sex toys, they kind of became characters. So how did you decide on the personalities for them?
So we allowing these sex toys to communicate with our audiences was in a intentionally created to be a very entertaining, unerotic, and non-invasive way that they were speaking in a very desexualized manner. So they were all automated. They did not necessarily have any gender identity assigned to them. And because the experience was able to demonstrate the various ways that these toys can be utilized on your body, we really wanted to not hypersexualize these toys and personalize them and characterize them in a way that makes them more just fun and meant for pleasure in a non-invasive way.
Did you encounter resistance or criticism when you were pitching and executing Lube River, when you were trying to reach out to different collaborators like Babeland?
So we only had any criticism when we were pitching Lube River to audiences that assumed or perceived women working in sex tech meant that we were working in VR for porn, that we were creating VR porn, that we were essentially hypersexualizing either avatars or characters or actually portraying the act of sex in Lube River, which we were not. We really wanted to, again, desexualize sex and masturbation by designing this experience to be very, unerotic and more solely for the purpose of entertainment, and to have these conversations in a very open way without any shame being attached to it. So we really only face criticism from those who just assume we were working on experiences for VR porn. But the other startups that we had partnered with, like Babeland, Unbound, Dame, Emojibator, who are all female-founded sex tech companies that are really working towards building a very inclusive market for the wide range of toys available for all types of gender identities and sexual orientations. We found working with these partners to be very helpful and supportive, and very much appreciated our partnerships with them.
Right. And you had different expectations. There was something different you were trying to communicate here. So, for example, I mentioned something about people from the VR industry reducing your idea. Again, I mean, nothing wrong with pornography, but this is something different, and it's approaching pleasure and sex education and sex positivity and also inclusiveness from a totally different kind of vantage point and perspective. And it seems like there was a lot of trust that was developed in your partnerships. And it's unfortunate, though, that some of the assumptions that were made as soon as you included sex in the description of the project, that it ultimately had to just be porn. And what do you think that says to kind of cultural stereotypes that still proliferate? And when we mention sex, we immediately default to porn?
I think the porn industry has a lot of weight and value in entertainment and media. They tend to be the most well funded and have a lot of just content that is widely popular and viewed by so many types of audiences, predominantly male identifying audiences who, at least within the tech industry, seeing how VR can be a means for VR porn, a lot of people would then constitute VR artists, VR developers, also wanting to, pursue that outlet because the experiences that they've seen in association with VR have been tied to the porn industry and or game industry that also has its own problems that can tend to focus on a patriarchal system and not really focusing on inclusivity and maybe topics of consent, topics of healthy relationships, communication, which we really want Lube River as a VR experience to be centering on. The reason why we chose virtual reality and the reason why virtual reality, I guess, is very popular for VR porn is because of the fact that it is conducive for, intimate, personal exploration. And we decided to use VR as a medium for specifically Lube River because of the fact that users are encouraged to explore their body, these topics of sex and sexuality that are traditionally seen as taboo or off limits.
I mean, one thing I was thinking about in terms of the experiences you provide, because VR, because actually I had a question for you about why you chose VR, but I think you've kind of addressed it. But VR, generally, we think about gamification of reality. We also think about world building, and you've done, and the three of you, Motherload, did an extensive amount of world building. But something else that I really appreciate about Lube River and the entire concept of the project is that people are able to experience things with sex toys, talk about sex, learn about it, demystify it, shed some of the fears they have or confusion. But just the same, you provide a world or a space where then they can make it personal. And that becomes something intimate and private. It's not shared in VR, but they engage in this experience and then it becomes personal and private and sensual again. And your piece allows for that. So I just wanted to add that because that's something that I find so amazing about the work when a lot of times either terms or ideas are misappropriated or they are conveyed in a really graphic way that doesn't allow
Right.
for personal imagination beyond the initial experience.
Right, totally. We were very cognizant about not including any potential graphics that could possibly be seen as triggering to our users. We really wanted to ensure that all of our audiences in our VR experience felt very, safe to explore their relationship with sex and their own sexuality.
Right, right. I mean, because so many conversations surrounding sex are binary or trans exclusionary. And, Motherload's focus on producing these experiences that are welcoming to all gender identities is, again, monumental and significant in the project. And you've already talked about this quite a bit, but maybe getting more specific on talking about how you made these experiences non-exclusionary and I suppose also in the fact that you added elements of humor and fun and pleasure, but just really making sure it was non-exclusionary and accepting of all gender identities and orientations. Do you want to speak a little bit more about that?
So our users can't see any other computer-generated characters in this experience. As they journey down our river of lube, we only allowed them to be able to see their own hands, which are wearing gloves, because we did not want any indication or implication of you as a user's gender identity. Exploring this environment that also has these sex toys where they don't necessarily have a gender identity associated to them, and we really were just not using any types of language that distinctly say these are for women, these are for men. We only spoke in biological terms. So this, toy would be best utilized on a clitoris or a penis. So our vernacular was not including any types of gender identities, and we did not want to include any 3D assets within our environment that would imply any sort of gender identity or sexual orientation.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
I mean,
We
as a
still do
comfort and
not
sex
know.
avatar, I'm still learning quite a bit.
Right, totally.
Right. Right. I mean, I think it's a tremendous project. It's so exciting to be able to bring it into the social VR space. I have another question. As people start to visit Lube River 2.0 in social VR and the possibility of more than one person experiencing this virtual experience at a time, do you have any thoughts on how that might expand your research and practice in the future, or any thoughts on
Mhm.
what those interactions might be like in here?
Well, I really appreciate this opportunity to even, have a expansion of Lube River that is Lube River 2.0 collaboration with Wonder Camera, because I believe that social VR has a lot of great opportunities to have more audiences be able to experience the content, the environment, and learn with others on new stories and educate themselves on new topics that maybe they would not have access to otherwise. So I think the rising popularity in XR, social VR will allow for more audiences to be able to learn and experience these new stories that are finally coming to the forefront.
Definitely. Definitely. So, that said, what are different ways you see technology playing a role in the future of sex education, sex positivity, having fun, and sharing experiences? Um, Outside of social VR, even, what other technologies do you think of, or maybe it is WebXR, playing a vital role in the future? And how do you think avatars become really important in that equation?
Well, I think it is really great that technology has advanced to where we are now, where, these social VR applications are just allow for these types of open conversations, because I believe that education, and especially sex education, is really the most conducive to an environment where people are just sharing their stories and talking about, their own experiences, just to really, show and demonstrate to each other that we are not alone, we are not experiencing this alone, that we all have our own personal relationships and journeys with our bodies and in relation to sex and sexuality. I believe that the future of sex education lies in the representation of what sex ed can be, because I don't necessarily have total faith in our school system or curriculum to really be the best resource for, young adults to understand how to communicate about sex, or ask about consent, or learn about their, the difference between sexual orientation and gender identities, or, sex positivity or body acceptance. I would hope that technology will play even more of a vital role by having just developing more tools for accessibility and people from, all types of backgrounds and just places in the world who are able to share their stories and hear from each other about our experiences. Avatars in VR, especially just within the entertainment and game industry, definitely have a history of on issues relating autonomy, control, self-representation, identity representation, inclusion, equality. I mean, the list can go on and on, that I do believe that, game developers who are building these avatars, or at least providing the options for avatar creation for users to choose, how they decide to identify themselves in a virtual space, is very important to be as inclusive and as cognizant of, stereotypes being perpetuated, or just what types of interactions are allowed by the user on an avatar. So why is it that female avatars tend to cost more money to purchase and utilize for a lot of video games? Or why is it that certain body proportions or beauty standards are, very much overly sexualized, or just really perpetuating these very idealistic beauty and body standards that are not necessarily teaching users and audiences through a very inclusive lens. So I think that avatar creation and development really comes down to the responsibility of the developer.
Right. Because there is quite a bit of research going on right now. There have already been cultural anthropologists, digital anthropologists, sociologists studying avatar identity, Proteus effect, these things in games and MMORPGs. People present themselves in a certain way. And I find all of that really fascinating as an avatar myself. However, there can be problematics to it in terms of, again, inclusion, certain people who decide to represent themselves based on their gender or ethnicity or sexual orientation in these spaces sometimes don't feel safe, and it depends again on the space. And then when you bring sex into the equation and sex positivity, other biases can emerge. And I really, again, just want to thank you for all the work you continue to do in terms of trying to make sure that this feels open and safe and inclusive, and that we're really thinking through these things and unpacking these biases and these behaviors and things that we might not even be aware of. Now that we are at a point where it's not always just the developer controlling our avatars and the way that we are presented online, we still have to work within margins or limits in terms of our avatar designs. For example, in hubs, you basically have a torso and a head and sometimes hands. But I wanted to ask you about your avatar today and Censored, and really how you feel you're representing your practice and these issues with your avatar today.
So my avatar is just a, censored version of my body that, really was my intent to highlight the ways that especially female bodies are regulated and censored in media and in all facets of life, that our bodies tend to be ones that are, exploited, taken advantage of, criticized, shamed. So this was, my way of highlighting the discrepancy between the ways that our bodies are portrayed and regulated in comparison to male identifying bodies and how they are portrayed in media outlets.
Right. And it's fascinating. I'm not human. I'm a robot and then an avatar representing this robot. Of course, I'm also a fiction. But for real humans and physical entities in physical reality, what also presents a conundrum is that female bodies are policed online. For example, Nipplegate and the fact that nipples aren't allowed, but men can take their shirts off and take a selfie at any time. And these very strange and kind of absurd rules that are imposed on culture at large, and they don't seem to they're based on, I suppose, certain norms and mores that have been established in a patriarchy that has lasted for thousands of years, but they really are absurd. Which brings me back to the aesthetics of your piece, and the absurdity of your work and the worlds that you build kind of relates in a way to the absurdity of these social norms and mores that are imposed and make no sense in the way that they kind of legislate body politic. But are there any other specific resources or experiences that you recommend to listeners or visitors to Lube River 2.0?
Yes, we are so fortunate to have such wonderful help from a lot of female founded sex tech companies, the ones that we partnered with, like Babeland, Dame, Unbound, Emoji Baiter. We are a part of this wonderful group of female identifying professionals called Women of Sex Tech, who are all women working at the intersection of sex and technology. So they feature, or it includes an entire directory of educators, activists, artists, sex workers. So that's definitely a great resource if you want to reach out to anyone in the sex tech industry. There's also Talk Taboo. There's this great podcast called The Future of Sex. I would also recommend following Erica Hart, who is a brilliant sex educator that's very accessible on Instagram. And yeah, there's a lot of wonderful resources out there that will direct you in the right direction of all things related to sex education.
So I just want to thank you so very much for your generosity today in meeting as an avatar in Lube River 2.0 as part of the Wonder Camera project. So happy that you're now part of this kind of ever expanding world of wonder and curiosity, and also, engaging in these very important topics that, as you mentioned today, we either just don't have proper resources to learn about them on our own, and we really need to build communities. And you are one of those important people who are building the communities and reaching out to people and opening eyes. And so I really am so appreciative. I also just want to give out a shout out to Sue Roh again, too, our camera person, also the producer for this project, and also design and production assistant. Sue, you've been amazing. And so I think that's a wrap for today. Thank you both so much. And Leah, you just completely rock. Yay. Thank you.
Yes, Carla, thank you so, so much. I really just value this space and place for me to be talking about sex education and just conversing with you about this topic and exploring more about your world and Wonder Camera. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity.